Campaign 2018 is sponsored by Wisconsin Hospital Association, Wisconsin Counties Association, Wisconsin Realtors Association, Marshfield Clinic, and Campaign 2018 partner Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel.
WisconsinEye is in Marshfield. We're interviewing Margaret Engebretson of Balsam Lake. She's a Democratic candidate in the 7th Congressional District. Margaret, welcome. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Steve, for having me.
You've listed a number of issues on your website. I'm going to ask you this question. What do you consider the top issue in your campaign, please?
The top issue that I've been hearing from folks in the district is their concern about our healthcare system. Okay. So once elected, I'll fight for a Medicare for All public health insurance program.
And how would you pay for it?
You would bring down costs over the entire medical system. Mm-hmm. And so that ties into a lot of this talk about how our trust fund for Medicare is going to be depleted very soon. So the main reason for that is because of rising healthcare costs. So once we switch over to a Medicare for All health insurance program, we'll be able to bring costs down across the entire system.
Yeah, I think the latest projection is that Medicare is scheduled to run out of money 2026. Do I have that, Margaret?
I think that's the latest estimate, yes.
Would you phase that in with a means test, or would you just automatically go to healthcare for all?
Well, we cannot just flip a switch and do this. It's unrealistic. So the first step that we would need to do is allow folks to buy in to Medicare regardless of circumstance. Another issue that's going on here is with the 2017 tax bill that the Republicans passed, it took out some cost saving and controlling measures out of Medicare. So we would need to reinstitute those measures and then also allow people to buy in and then transition.
Is that a tax bill you would have voted against?
Yes.
Why?
Because essentially what it did is provide huge tax breaks, a huge windfall for the wealthy and corporations. And most of the wealth went to the top 1%, while, regular middle class and lower income folks got a short-term bump, but that is due to expire unless Congress steps in and makes it permanent. So I think we need to repeal and replace that tax bill.
Do we need to make other changes in our national tax structure that are part of your platform?
Absolutely. So what's going on here is that we have, especially since this tax bill, we have blown a hole in our deficit. So while the scaremongering has been going on for years about the deficit, we must tighten our belts and whatnot, as soon as the Republicans gain majorities in both houses and the White House, the first thing that they put through with all Republican votes, without hearings, without working with Democrats, they pushed through this tax bill and blew a hole in the deficit. I think the latest estimate I saw is $1.9 trillion. So if you're going to do that with the deficit, you need to be investing in things like infrastructure and education, not just providing this tax windfall. So our tax rates for corporations and the ultra wealthy are too low. Now, I understand worldwide the statutory tax rate for corporations was on the higher end of other OPEC countries. Well, the real tax rate of what they were actually paying is much lower due to the fact that we have such regulatory and congressional capture by special interests and corporations that all these loopholes are put in there, and so the effective tax rate is really much lower. So the first step that we need to do is repeal and replace that tax bill. We need to close these loopholes, like the carried interest loophole, and start bringing in more revenue to pay for the things we absolutely need, like a standing military, our infrastructure, improve our education system.
Now, you use the term ultra wealthy. What's your definition of that?
There are different models that you can use. I just read one the other day where if we adjusted the tax rate on people that have an income higher than $1 million, for example. So you can run through these different scenarios. I think it's like an engine. When I was a locomotive electrician, when I was troubleshooting what was wrong, I would isolate certain parts to identify what was going wrong with it. So I don't think it would be prudent to just, for example, flip the switch on Medicare for all, flip the switch and change the tax code. We need to adjust it as we go and see where this runs right. It's very, all of this works together, and we need to be mindful of that.
You mentioned military spending. The Trump administration sent Congress a budget that would have taken military spending to about $700 billion a year, which is a big increase. Can you justify that increase if you're a member of Congress?
The thing about military spending, and this has been going on for a long time, is that our military has been politicized. So both parties have been saying, yes, we want to spend this X amount on the military and whatnot as part of a platform piece. I think it is unwise to throw some arbitrary number, like it's 700 billion, I guess is the last one, at the military. What we need to do is ensure that our military is well trained, well equipped, and well positioned to do their job, and that is to defend the United States of America. We also need to evaluate our global commitments around the world. Now, I'm not saying we need to pull back or put more in. What I'm saying is that it's really vital that we remove talk of military out of the political realm as best we can, because the folks that you're sending overseas are your sons, your daughters, your neighbors. We're people, and we need to be very mindful when we send them into harm's way.
You mentioned the deficit it now, as you're aware, is more than 21 trillion with a T. Can we address a deficit without putting some spending limits or restraints on the big three, Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid?
Well, let's take on Social Security. Now, this is one of those instances where there has been a lot of scaremongering about the deficit. Oh boy, we're going to have to go after Social Security because the trust fund is depleting. Now, for decades, we have known about the baby boomer bulge that is going to be working its way through the Social Security system. We have been planning for that. Now, this system is the most beloved and useful social programs in American history. And like many programs like that, it does require tweaking over time. And to say that the trust fund is going to be completely depleted by X date, there are things you can do to adjust what's going into that trust fund. For example, we can raise the cap on payroll taxes, on how much we do there.
Mm-hmm. And is that a form of means testing? Because that has also been talked about.
I have not studied that particular thing on that. You also spoke about going after the big three, right?
Yes.
So Medicare, Medicaid,
Social Security.
Right. So I think we need to flip this on its head, and we need to recognize that these programs work, and they're vital, and they need maintenance to operate effectively, instead of disingenuinely scaremongering about the deficit. There are many things we can do. As far as Medicare, the thing that is causing that to have trouble is because of the rising medical costs, and this has been going on for decades. It's outstripping inflation.
There's two major issues now, and one of them is our tariffs, economic issues. The Trump administration tariffs, your position on them?
The way I look at tariffs, they should be used like a scalpel instead of a sledgehammer. So prior administrations, Republican, Democratic, we have entered into trade agreements with other nations where business interests are well represented, but we have left out labor and environmental impacts out of this. So only one of the stakeholders here is really having a big say, and it has allowed our workforce and our manufacturing and our country and our environment to be harmed under these agreements. So there is understandable frustration by the American people who have been shorted under these trade agreements. So President Trump did identify a real thing, that we have imbalance going on. So tariffs, instead of slapping on huge tariffs on aluminum and steel, which is high up the supply chain, without taking into account everything else that is tied in together, jobs that'll be lost, companies that'll go under, we need to adjust our trade relationships with the countries, other countries, and we also need to, when we need to use tariffs, use it as a scalpel, not a sledgehammer.
The other major issue nationally and internationally is immigration. Your position on what changes should be in any new immigration law, please.
So our immigration system is broken. We have been struggling to find a solution for a long time. Bills have come up, there's hope about the bills, and then the hopes are dashed. So currently, this family separation crisis created by President Trump is an example of how our current immigration system is subject to maladministration. So we have approximately 11 million undocumented immigrants in the United States right now. So we have basically four options. One, we continue on with how it is right now, and we see the weaknesses in that. Two, we can have mass deportation, which is unrealistic in practice, and it would harm our economy. It would devastate us. Three, we could provide some sort of path to something short of full citizenship and create a second-class status within our country, which is not in accordance with being under our Constitution. Or the final thing is, we must provide a path to citizenship for the undocumented immigrants in this country, and we must also be realistic about what's going on the border with Mexico. So I know there are people advocating for a physical wall. That is not the best way to spend our money to regulate our border. Now, as a sovereign nation, we have a right and responsibility to control our borders and control who comes and goes from our nation. But we must do so in a professional, humane manner. And that includes sending enough border agents down there, judges down there, attorneys down there to actually deal with the real world on the ground situation of people fleeing violence and devastation in their countries, seeking asylum in this country.
You mentioned those four options. Obviously, number two is not acceptable to you because you can't deport that many people. What about number three and number four? So what's your position? Something a little less than citizenship, or a path to citizenship?
So we've tried in this country, in our history, having a group of people, an identifiable group of people living in our country with something less than full citizenship, right? We've done that before with African Americans, Native Americans, and we have grown as a country and realized that we the people means all of us, right? It is not sustainable in a constitutional republic, liberal democracy such as ours to abide by that, right? It's just wrong. And besides that, we are missing out on their on what they give to our country, their ingenuity, their hard work, their, they serve in our military, they're teachers, they do everything. And my thinking on this is, just like generations before, we have had immigrants come to this country, and I welcome them. They're coming here for the American idea, for freedom and liberty, and that is what this country stands for. So 3 is out, in my opinion. So a path to citizenship is the only realistic way then left, and so we need to get serious about this, stop politicizing it, much like we do with the military and other big issues like that to win elections, short term, every 2 years and whatnot. We need to be realistic about what's going on here and provide a path to citizenship.
Some Democrats, including Wisconsin Congressman Mark Pocan, have now said we should abolish ICE. Should we?
I don't agree with that statement.
Yeah.
So institutions and organizations that are run by our government, so ICE is a great example, the FBI, you name it, right? How that agency runs really takes its tone and its direction and its policy choices from the top. So if you are in a government agency where the culture there and the policies there are toxic, it is no wonder you are going to have toxic outcomes out at the public-facing end of that agency. So, for example, I was in the military for 24 years, and then I retired. I've been in different military commands with different cultures, different commanding officers. I also was a corrections officer for a time between college and law school. Now, I know that now the military is for defense, and we carry arms, we have a lot of power, but we can also act professionally and ethically and also maintain our unit readiness and perform our duties. Also, as a corrections officer, we had a good culture there. So we didn't have these issues with people coming in under arrest and then having issues with corrections officers and whatnot. So it really depends on the culture. Now, I have not gone in deep into what ails ICE. I can see why people are wanting to abolish it, because the public-facing part of ICE, the news reports coming out are absolutely inhumane and unacceptable.
Got it. President Trump and other Republicans have expressed doubts about whether climate change is real. What do you think is the threat posed? Do you think climate change poses a threat to the nation and world?
Yes, I do. I believe that climate change is real, first off. And the number one thing we need to do is reduce carbon emissions, right? So we are already seeing in the United States and around the world the effects of climate change. It is causing migration patterns of people to move because they cannot farm where they live. We have in the United States where people do not have access to water anymore because of climate change, water levels rising. So we are feeling real, quantifiable harm from climate change. And we know that carbon is the thing that we need to reduce. So there are things that we must do. And one of those things is provide a regulatory system that controls carbon and incentivize decreasing carbon output by our industries. And we also need to support industry and government agencies to explore clean energy technologies for our future. And we must do it now. We also must re-enter the Paris Climate Accord.
The national debate over gun laws in light of the mass shootings and school shootings. Do you support changes in our nation's gun laws?
Yes, I do. Like I said, I served in the military for 24 years. I am trained on M16s. I am trained on various sidearms. I'm trained on anti-tank weaponry. I've also trained in explosives. Now, all of these things are tools to do a specific task. And before we used these tools, we were well trained. We abided by intense safety measures to make sure that we do not harm people and our fellow service members. And that's how I view it. I am a gun owner. So in the context of our nation, I believe that it's perfectly fine to have weapons for deer hunting. In fact, a lot of folks where I live stock their freezers for the winter with deer. And they also have weapons for home protection. That is perfectly fine. But we must be realistic about what's going on here. We have a mass shooting epidemic. We have gun violence that is out of control in the domestic violence realm. We have a suicide issue going on. So we must have full background checks. We can limit magazine sizes, ban the sale of military-style weapons, and also, you know, help folks with the other issues like mental health support, and look at this holistically.
As someone who's spent, I think, 24 years in the
Yes.
military, how do we provide better care, medical care for our nation's veterans?
There has been a lot of talk about how the VA is letting down our veterans, and if you trace back where this is coming from, there is a very large portion of business that wants to privatize the VA so that they can make money off of our veterans. Now, at the time of the 2016 election, I just so happened to be recovering from major shoulder surgery I had done at the VA in Minneapolis, and I'm very grateful for it. That's where I get my medical care, and I just have a little ID card. I can go to any VA in the world. They know my healthcare history and how it all fits together. It works great. One of the things that causes the VA to malfunction is when we politicize it, for one thing, and we underfund that agency. So we need to fund it properly. And yes, we must also have programs for rural veterans. So there, in Wisconsin, we have remote clinics. I think that with better funding and good leadership and good culture, the VA is really quite a marvel.
The 7th District, huge district, and on your website you talk about the need to help small businesses. You need to talk about broadband, roads, rails. Talk to me about what you perceive as the infrastructure needs or the need to help small businesses in the 7th District. How does a nation do that?
So what we need to do, and what I've noticed where I live in rural Wisconsin, I graduated from law school in 2010 and I went to Balsam Lake and I opened up a small solo practice. And just 2 years earlier we had the financial crash. And what I noticed there is as the wealth seeped out of our communities, we all started to feel the pinch of this. And small businesses are intertwined with how high the wages are at the person at the bar and grill, how our dairy farm down the road is doing. We are all intertwined. One of the issues is healthcare, one of the biggest issues, and that's why I think that this is the first issue we should address. So as a small business owner, and I've spoken with other small business owners, they are unable to take on employees because they cannot afford to pay for their health care coverage. So that is one thing we need to do. Another thing we need to do is provide the technical infrastructure such as broadband speed. When I use my internet at home, it's at times frustratingly slow, and at my business it was frustratingly slow. You can drive for an hour in this district and lose your cell phone coverage. We have roads that are so bumpy, by the time you've traveled 10 miles, you have a blistering headache. I mean, it is not good. And our rail lines have been left to go into disrepair because the big rail companies, the Class 1 railroads, and you can understand it is not in their financial best interest to keep these short lines open. Now, if we looked at this as a whole and provided the infrastructure for our people to come here and build a business, they know they would be able to access, our state economy, our nation's economy, and the global economy. We would be able to compete with this kind of infrastructure support.
You talk about on your campaign website about a $15 minimum wage. Do you see that as a national standard, since those are normally set by states?
I think that is the bare minimum. So this is like that light switch thing that we cannot do with Medicare and taxes and whatnot. So we can't just flip the switch, put the minimum wage up to $15 an hour. Now, I know businesses in Balsam Lake that employ people would not be able to withstand that switch, right? So we need to work our way up to higher wages. The underlying issue here is that so many people do not even have a living wage. So they can work full-time, over full-time, and they are not bringing home enough money to paint their house. You can see it in the disrepair in the homes and the farms, especially over where I live. I mean, it's just devastating. So we need to think of this as a whole machine that works together and get resources back to the 7th. And that's what I'll do. I'll fight to bring resources home to the 7th.
Okay. Some Democrats in the U.S. House are talking about, if the Democrats take over the House, beginning the process of impeaching President Trump. Would you be one of them if you're elected?
This is a huge issue, and I know that their passions are running high in this country. So in our Constitution, the way it's designed is that we have 3 branches of government that provide a check and balance on the other branches. What's gone wrong under the Trump administration and with the Republican control of both houses is that Congress is not performing its constitutional role to provide a check on the executive branch. So it's not providing actual oversight. It is not conducting hearings. It is not providing legislation that we need, as Democratic norms have been ignored and sidelined that previous presidents have followed without having to be, a law to tell them. These are things that Congress can and should do. They're required to do under their oath. So once Democrats attain the majority in at least the House, what we need to do is do less drastic measures than impeachment first. So we have to provide oversight. We have to conduct hearings and go step by step and follow that pattern. Though impeachment may be justifiable at some point, right now I think it would be so traumatic to the body politic. I mean, we all know that we are so divided right now and tensions are high, that this would be such a serious step that we must not undertake that lightly. And I do not plan on undertaking that lightly.
If your party takes the U.S. House and you're a member of the U.S. House, would you vote to re-elect Speaker Nancy Pelosi as Speaker?
Let's cross that bridge when we get to it. Now, a lot has changed. I just, for example, read another article in I think it was the New York Times this morning, talking about tension within both parties with their leaders, both
Yes.
Paul Ryan and Nancy Pelosi. You pick up the paper, every week there's some story like this. I have not been in Congress yet. I want to get there and evaluate where we're at that time and who would be the best leader at that time. I think it is counterproductive to plan that far ahead. I have a primary to win. I have a general election to win. So that's what I'm focused on.
And then my final question is, you do have a primary opponent on August 14th. You want to highlight differences between you and your primary opponent?
Sure. So while my opponent and I share a lot of common values and we agree on many topics, our backgrounds are very different, and so consequently our approaches to how we need to do things and the direction we need to go are going to be very different. So if you are generally comfortable with the direction of our country and the state of things, and you would like to tweak around the edges of current things to improve them, I'm not your candidate for that. If you want bold leadership, if you want someone who understands that we are at a very serious juncture in our country right now, and we must make some fundamental changes, as I spoke of earlier, Medicare for all, fix the tax code, infrastructure, stuff like that. If you want a bold approach, if you want a candidate that will fight every single day for the people of the 7th Congressional District to make that happen, then I'm your candidate.
Thank you. Margaret Engebretson of Balsam Lake is a Democrat running in the 7th Congressional District. The primary is August 14th. Margaret, thank you for talking to Wisconsin.
Thank you so much, Steve. Appreciate it.
Thanks.
Campaign 2018 is sponsored by Wisconsin Hospital Association, Wisconsin Counties Association, Wisconsin Realtors Association, Marshfield Clinic, and Campaign 2018 partner Milwaukee Journal Sentinel.